This is our last month of spending time with the emergence of Christianity, and I think it's going to be a fabulous month. This is the first and only time that I will speak to you about the emergence of Christianity, of which I am totally fine with, because honestly, I am not a church historian. It wasn't my thing. I did really well in seminary in church history, but it was a long time ago, and I don't really recall a lot of this stuff. And the historians are obviously Troy and Father Bill. And so the good news is next week Troy will talk to you about the rise and fall of imperial Christianity. And
mostly the rise.
Mostly the rise. Okay. There is no fall. Praise the Lord. And then Bill will conclude our time surveying the first 1,000 years of Christianity with one session on Islam called No God But One God, and then finally Christ and Power. I'm just so excited about this month. So you'll want to make sure that you're available Sundays at 9. So I am glad to talk to you about what I tongue-in-cheek called the Asian flavors of Christianity. I am a person of Asian descent. Obviously, my folks are from India, and it's natural and I think and beautiful that one of the ways that people immediately will find some kind of way to connect with me is tell me how much they love Indian food as soon as they find out I'm Indian. And I'm just delighted by that because I like Indian food too. And there's something about the flavor of Christianity that I just thought really fit for today. You have a handout. It's a single page because I decided to do a PowerPoint today. I'm a techie girl, but I was telling Peggy I'm really not good at PowerPoints. So it's a pretty basic PowerPoint. But I wanted to do it because I really thought that PowerPoints are super cool when you're trying to show a different culture. And so I attempted as best to capture what I could from what's on the internet about stuff that happened 1,000 years ago, which, surprisingly there isn't that much. And so this handout is for you. Now, I have a disclaimer. On my notes, I was going to write the beautiful verse from the Gospel of John. Of course, the Gospel of John is thought to have been a gospel that was written probably in the 90s. So at this point, there has been missionaries going out to the ends of the earth, so to speak, proclaiming the gospel. And so this is thought to have been a gospel written to people who were already experiencing a kind of Christian diaspora. And in this gospel, Jesus prays to God, to the Father, for his disciples. And he says in John 17, I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who will believe me through their word, that they all may be one. So this understanding that when you send out people to the ends of the earth and begin to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ in the place, in the space, in the culture that you find yourself in, that there's a deep desire on behalf of Christ himself for unity among the people. Now this was going to be kind of my ending statement, and so I wrote it down on my notes, but then found out I actually put it on the handout. Whoops! So you end up with it, so now you know how I'm going to end. We're going to talk about that. So the way I'd like to begin, though, is to ask some basic questions. One, how do Euro-Asian churches impact our understanding and practice of Christianity in the West? We're going to be looking at 4 different countries. We're going to be looking at Armenia, which is in Euro-Asia, which I have no idea what that means, but I'm being accurate. And then we're going to look at the country of Georgia, which I think is still a country, yeah?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
all right.
yes.
And again, thought to be in Euro-Asia. And then we're going to look at China and India. And if you are not geographically literate like me, maybe you'll appreciate the map that's on the back. This map comes straight out of Wilkins' book. So it has all the necessary pieces. And just so you can see, here's the map over here. this is Armenia, right? So here's Greece, and here is, where's Jerusalem? Is it right here? Is that about right?
A little further out.
Okay, so Jerusalem is here, and then here is Armenia. So remember, they started here, the disciples and the apostles, to start to spread the good news, the gospel, and they wanted to go to Asia, didn't quite make it, and so here's Armenia, up here's Georgia,
Right.
and then all the way over here is, I'm going to butcher these words, so forgive me. Xi'an. Okay, Xi'an in China, and down here is Malabar in India.
Right.
So, and remember, they didn't have planes, trains, or automobiles, right? Okay, so we get how far the gospel has to go in order to have impact. All right. So, all right, so the first question is then, how do these churches and the way that they are and grew up and then maybe the way they are today impact the way we practice our faith here in the West? And then the second question is, what exactly is the purpose of ethnic churches? So I'm always fascinated when somebody will say, I belong to a Syrian church. I belong to a Chaldean church. I belong to a Russian Orthodox church. What is the purpose of identifying the nation state or country with the flavor of Christianity? Is there something to that? Is there something that we need to deliberately think about? Okay, good. All right, so let's go to Armenia. So Armenia is actually a very kind of mountainous country. The Caucasoid Mountains, I think, Caucasus, are there. And it also is where Mount Ararat is found. And Mount Ararat is well known because it was the first place where they found land on the Ark. So if you go to St. John Armenian Church's website, which is in Southfield, Michigan, it was established 81 years ago, so what, 7-8 years after Christ Church Cranbrook. They actually have as kind of like their motto about Armenia, home of Noah's Ark. So you know something about the importance and maybe the historic significance of Armenia.
Is that tradition or fact?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Is there a Mount Ararat today?
Yeah, that I know. but I
Is
need to
it
bit
in
about the
Armenia?
ark. The ark is what I meant.
Oh, well that's biblical.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
it's biblical.
so one of the astronauts is actually thought he saw the ark from space and is trying to find it on some kind of thing. I don't know. It probably wasn't successful. We would have heard about it.
Interesting.
I'm half Armenian, so I have an authority.
Woohoo!
No, I'm not. I don't know anything about it actually, but I do know that they did some historical archaeological research on it, and it is quite possible that that was. There is some evidence to say that there was a flood and there was this thing, and yeah.
I think for me the significance is that it was important to identify because of the ancient nature of that. That meant that there was the existence of the God of Israel as early as Noah's Ark in that space and place. Because Armenia, well, it depends on who you ask, will not hear the gospel until about 300 AD. There is some legend, or legend's the wrong word, apocryphal tradition that some of the apostles showed up in Armenia and preached the gospel. But most Armenians will talk about Gregory the Illuminator. Now, Gregory was born in a wealthy family in Armenia, but his dad murdered the Armenian king. And he got caught and he was executed himself. So here's Gregory, and he feels very, very horrible about this. So he decides that he is going to go to the king and repent by serving the king. So this is exactly what he does. He goes to a king, I'm going to butcher the name again, Tiridates, and he offers himself. And so he does so, and Tiridates accepts, the king accepts. Well, while he's working with the king asks him to worship the pagan god that they worship, whose name is Anahit. And Gregory refuses, because Gregory had learned about Jesus. And so the king becomes furious and says, "You have come and you joined us as a stranger and foreigner. How then are you able to worship that God whom I do not worship?" So the king did what kings usually do, which is throw Gregory in prison and forget about him for 13 years. Before that, by the way, he did hang him upside down and flog him, and fasten blocks of wood to his legs and tighten them. Okay, so he's in prison. This is Gregory, all right? And meanwhile, we have, under the Emperor Diocletian in Rome, we have a bunch of nuns. One of them who's called Ripsine, and the other one is called Gaian. So that's Ripsine, that's Gaian. All right, so Ripsine is beautiful. She's absolutely beautiful, but she's not. And the Emperor Diocletian sees her and decides he wants her. And she, of course, is a nun, and so she flees. And she ends up in Armenia, along with all the other nuns who were also fleeing this Emperor Diocletian. And there were about 37 of them. So they end up in Armenia, and guess what happens? A king, Tiridates, spies her, and lo and behold, he wants her too. So she refuses again, and the king tortures the mother, the abbot, or whatever they call the head nun. But Ripsine refuses to give in, and so the king does what kings do. He just killed them all 37 of them. Well, apparently, God gets upset with this. So he visits a horrible punishment on the king and gives him demon possession. So he's possessed by a demon, and he's reduced to insanity, and he has to flee to the hills where the pigs are. This should sound a little familiar. And so he's out there in the wilderness. This is the king, right? And his whole entire court is with him too, because apparently they're demon-possessed also. And the sister of the king is like, "This is crazy. We need to fix this." And she has a vision to send for that guy who's been in prison for 13 years. So they bring him up, and lo and behold, he sees the king. The king rushes to him. Gregory gets down, kneels on his knees, and prays. And immediately the king comes to his senses. So at this point, Gregory is asked for forgiveness by the king. The king wants to be baptized, and so Gregory goes to Caesarea to become a bishop, comes back, and baptizes the king and anyone else who happens to be on the Ephesus River, and the king declares, "We are now all Christians." So all Armenians became Christians in about the year 301, and that is the first country in the world ever to be all Christian. That is something the Armenians can claim. I did talk to Troy because I was a little confused. I thought, well, wait, I thought Constantine was involved in all this, and didn't he make the whole empire Christian? Right. But apparently that didn't happen under his rule. It happened under Theodosius later on. So Armenia does indeed get the prize for doing this.
But even Theodosius wasn't claiming that all Romans would suddenly be Christian. So this is kind of unprecedented in that top-down format, right? Theodosius said that Christianity was now the official religion of the Roman Empire, but that didn't preclude other people from holding pagan beliefs or Jews holding Jewish beliefs and so forth.
Okay, so,
Yeah, everybody was supposed to check.
yeah,
By the king's decree.
yeah, you were all baptized, period, end of conversation. And to make sure that happened, the king went about and destroyed all the pagan shrines and all the pagan temples in the area, and he built churches. He built a church. Now, St. Gregory, in the midst of this, had a vision after he became bishop and got all of Armenians to become Christian, that Christ descended from heaven and struck the ground with a golden hammer at this particular spot. And so this particular spot is in which the Cathedral of the Holy Echmadizin, which means, of course, the only begotten descended here. That's where it was built. And nearby, apparently, are the relics of the martyred nuns that I told you about earlier. Now, this is not the original church built in the 4th century. It didn't survive. This was rebuilt a couple times, but it is well known because of its floor plan. So it's an octagonal structure. You can see it has the four kind of apses this way and 4 this way, so it's octagonal. And each one of these, I think, is kind of like an altar. And each one of these they call a sacristy. I'm not sure if that's true or not. And then so it's an octagonal structure that's sort of square, and it has a dome on top. And now we're talking about like 400, 500 AD. And what's extraordinary about this is apparently when you have a square structure, to put a round dome on it is really hard. And all the engineers here could tell you way more about it than I can, but I can show you this. If you know anything about architecture, Byzantine architecture is considered some of the pinnacle of human achievement. This is a Byzantine arch and dome. And you notice that they have to make what's underneath it kind of circular, cylindrical, it has to kind of go up to be able to hold that dome. And that's called pendatives, this black thing. What they did in Armenian architecture is something called squinches. And you can see it kind of looks like a triangle. And that is how they supported the dome above. Now, what this means is that according to a distinguished architectural historian, Armenian architecture is on equal footing to Byzantine architecture. It is radically different and uses various things, but that such a small country with this interesting story about how they embraced Christianity could create something so beautiful is what Wilkins is trying to prove. He's trying to prove that in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, that Christianity not only provided good news of the gospel, but it also led to the human flourishing of civilizations and peoples. And so that's pretty significant. All right, so here's what the dome looks like inside today. You can see the squinches, yeah? And the beautiful dome. And there's that's what it's actually called. And that's where it lives. And the church, the Armenian Orthodox Church, is also called the Armenian Apostolic Church. They're one and the same. It is actually the first cathedral built, ever. So again, Armenia. I didn't know any of this. Maybe you all knew it already. And I want you to, we're going to watch this because I thought it was really cool. Somebody actually went to the church recently, right, and took a YouTube video of it. So as we watch it, he does a kind of panorama, so you might get a little dizzy. But that way you can see sort of how they're worshiping. But I also want you to hear the liturgy and notice kind of culturally, would it resonate in Christchurch Cranbrook? you know, and if not, what does that mean, right? Okay, so let's see if I can make this happen.
That's right. State-wise, you'd want. That's right. State-wise, you'd $100 with the promotion coins.
Time out, okay. Cool.
You can go on YouTube and see longer versions, but I have one for y'all. What are your thoughts about that kind of worship?
Sounds very Catholic.
Sounds very Catholic, chant. To me, it had a very kind of Asian tone to it. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's how I heard it. It resonated with kind of what I've heard in the Middle East and Asia. Okay.
And it's particularly good to be hearing it today, because today is Orthodox Easter.
Is it really?
Yeah, Eastern Orthodox.
Today is Orthodox Easter. Okay. All
Oh, Easter.
right, thank you for that note. All right, let me tell you about one other remarkable person from Armenia. Again, keeping with Wilkins' idea that the bringing of Christianity to the peoples also brought new things to the civilization. This guy's name is Mesrop Mashtas. Again, butchering his name. And he was a very learned person. He was born in 361. And he learned Greek, Syriac, and Persian. So he learned all three. And he actually went to go work for the king and drafted the documents that they needed, because in Armenia, prior to Mashtots, there was no written language. So Armenian was spoken, and it was all oral, through oral tradition. They had no alphabet. So Mashtots comes, and he, of course, has learned Greek, Syriac, and Persian, and so he will take what they're saying in Armenian and translate it into other documents so that the king can send decrees out to whoever he needs to send this out to. Mashtots learned that there was this guy who was like, we need to create our own alphabet. And so they were basing it on the Semitic one, the Hebrew alphabet, and so they had worked really hard for a couple years. It was like a project that he and a couple of students were working on to try to create an alphabet that made sense, and it made no sense. It didn't work with the Armenian language, it was difficult, and he was like, this is not going to work. So then Mashtots, who ended up becoming a Christian monk earlier, and left the king because he wanted to just pray and be with God, he had an ecstatic vision. And in this ecstatic vision, he was given, out of the fire, the letters. I think there were 34 of them he was given. He added 2 more. He met with a calligrapher in Ephesus to try to make sure that he could get the writings done. And as a result, Mashtots created the Armenian language, written. 150 years from him doing that, they were translating the Old Testament, the New Testament, they were creating poetry, and it was all being written down. So that now, today, when they talk about ancient Armenian manuscripts, they're actually talking about something that was born out of Mashtots' vision and because of the work of Christian monks. Here is a huge statue that's been made to Mesrop Mashtots in Armenia at what's called the Institute of Ancient Manuscripts. And so he is fully remembered as the father of the Armenian language.
So what alphabet did you use?
He made it up.
So it's not Greek, it's not Cyrillic, it's not Roman.
Yeah, well, I think it was probably, again, he tried to use the Semitic one, it didn't work, and so he got these other ones. It said that he was given the vision of letters from the hand of God who wrote the alphabet in letters of fire. I actually, that's a great question, if it has any kind of, it looks similar to some other script. I don't know the answer to that. Sarah?
Also, between what is now Turkey, Asia Minor, and Armenia, there were areas, and somebody else may know about this as well, where the Christians were being tracked and arrested or taken into custody. This is modern day terms. Anyway, the Christians built themselves down layers under the ground, caves and places they could hide, and that were the equivalent of around 7 stories deep into the ground, trying to keep away from those who would
Persecute them.
Yeah. It's a very interesting area.
Okay, we're going to move to Georgia. Again, here is Armenia, and then here is the country of Georgia. I'm not really sure why Wilkin, picked out Georgia as opposed to, for instance, here is a place called Merv, and there was a lot of Christian culture developing in Merv, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later because it was on the Silk Road. But he emphasizes Georgia, and so we'll talk a little bit about it. Today in Georgia, 82% of the country practices Orthodox Christianity. It too is in the Caucasus Mountains, and because it was seaside, do you see that? There's the Black Sea. They had a lot of Greek guys come over and visit them. So there was thought that, they'd also bring their faith with them. But as it turns out, for Georgia, they like to talk about a woman named Nino, Saint Nino. And I forgot to write down the year, so you might have to look that up in Wilkin's book. But there's 2 traditions about Saint Nino, and what I love about this is she's the one who founded the religion in Georgia. Woman! Woohoo! So here's Saint Nino, and according to the Eastern Orthodox tradition, she's super rich, and she came from a family that had a Roman general as her dad, and then she also was related to Saint George somehow, and on her mom's side was the Patriarch of Jerusalem. So we're talking, a family that is really, really well off. And according to the Orthodox tradition, she was brought up by her relative who was a nun. And so she was brought up as a Christian. And at some point, she talked, the nun would talk about preaching the Christian gospel to Iberia. That's what Georgia was called back then. And so also there was thought that in Iberia was Christ's sacred robe. Now this was the robe that he had in the Gospel of John, the tunic on, that was seamless, woven from top to bottom, that they took and cast lots over. So it's thought that that sacred robe was in Iberia. So Saint Nino receives a vision where the Virgin Mary gives her a grapevine cross. So I don't know if you can notice that cross has kind of something attached to it. And the Virgin Mary says, "Go to Iberia and tell there the good tidings of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will find favor before the Lord, and I will be for you a shield against all visible and invisible enemies. By the strength of this cross you will erect in that land the saving banner of my faith in my beloved Son and Lord." So she goes and she enters into a little town, and oh, by the way, she too escaped persecution from that king. She was. Oh, so this must have been around the same time, around 300. Yeah, she was with the nuns who were being sought after by the king in Armenia. So she escaped that, went to Georgia, And she enters into a small town and she places a Christian cross there and she begins to preach and she converts people. Now, that's the Orthodox version. The Catholic version of St. Nino is that she was a slave. That she was a slave brought by not her own will. And there's nothing important about her family at all. And in this story, she's living in a small town and she's fasting and she's keeping penance and she's praying all the time. And everybody, all her neighbors, are really amazed at her austerity. So there was a tradition in the time in the towns when a child was sick, the mother would take the child house to house to try to get the child well, see if anybody could heal him. So they show up at Nino's little hub and give the child to the infant, to Nino. And Nino says that there's nothing that she can do to save the child, but that she would pray to her God Christ. So she places the infant on horsehair bed covering. Not really sure what the significance of that is, but it is most certainly horsehair. She offers prayers, and lo and behold, the child is healed. Well, the word gets out, and the word gets all the way to the Queen of Iberia. And the Queen of Iberia is sick. And so she sends for St. Nino. But here's what happens. St. Nino is praying and fasting and keeping penance and says, no, she cannot break that, and so she cannot go. So the Queen goes to St. Nino. And there, the Queen is placed on the bed covering made out of horsehair. And the same exact thing happens. Nino prays over the Queen, and the Queen is healed. Well, the king, whose name is Marian, is overjoyed, and he wants to send her gifts. But the Queen says, no, Nino's not going to accept any silver or gold. There's only one thing Nino wants. She wants us to become Christian. And the king's like, ain't going to happen. And then he goes out a couple days later to go hunt. And he gets lost. And so he gets down on his knees and he prays to Nino's God. And all of a sudden, the way is made clear. And he is now convinced that Christ is Lord. He gets baptized, and guess what he does? The whole country becomes Christian. So this is one of the things that happened both in Armenia and Georgia. Christianity came from the king and queen. He was baptized in 337, and he built a church. Now this church is not the church that he built, but it's the church where the king and queen are buried. This is the king, and this is the queen. And if you see, there's a picture. Here's the king, and that, believe it or not, is the queen. And I thought there would be a picture of St. Nino, but there wasn't. But instead, up on top, you see very clearly a picture of painting of Jesus Christ. Now, this is the church that they built in 300, 400 AD, right here. You can see, I just love this picture because you can see how large it is compared to the village itself. This church is called that.
Go for it.
Yeah, somebody? Anybody? Okay, all right. It's a cathedral itself in Georgia. And again, it was built and then destroyed, lots of wars and everything. It was rebuilt. So the one that we see is from about the 11th century. And it's surrounded by a defensive wall because on the top of the church they would keep guns. It was actually used for military purposes because you remember the picture that I showed you was the highest building in the space. It's a beautiful church. You're not going to be able to see this well but I was stunned at the pictures that I was able to find on the internet. Here are the little people, and this is the fresco of Christ. I mean, so it's massive. And there are beautiful icons everywhere. I mean, everywhere you turn, there's something to look at, something to see.
When was this church built?
So it was originally founded in the 4th century, and this one is thought to, the current one standing is 1100. In 2010, UNESCO looked at it and said it's really unstable. You better do something about it because earthquakes and wars and stuff, but it's still standing right now.
What town is it in? Is it right on the Black Sea?
I think you might have to Google that in terms of the town. Yeah, Google it. Okay. So that's Armenia and Georgia. Now let's go even farther east. I mean, look at how far somebody from Greece would have to go to get to Xi'an in China. But this was what was called the Silk Road, yeah? And you can see all the ways that the people got through there. And the Silk Road is, of course, very important. It was the principal route between the Mediterranean and the Far East. And it began way over there in Antioch, which is right here. And it went through Persia, you can see, and then all the way down to the Great Wall of China and Xi'an. And it carried goods like silk and spices, jewels, and perfume, and glassware. But these were merchants, people coming from the Mediterranean, and they also carried their cultures, their ideas, and their religion. So Wilkins says you cannot underestimate the importance of these Christian merchants who went and their ability to proclaim the gospel. Along with the Christian merchants, they were often accompanied by priests and monks. So this whole entire group ended up proclaiming the gospel to the Far East. Significantly, the monks and the clergy were Syriac speaking. So in this, Troy can correct me, but the significance of that is that we always talk about the Latin speaking and the Greek speaking Christians because they had the most impact on Europe and therefore us, right? But it took the Syriac-speaking ones who were in Persia to do all the rest of the world. And we just don't know enough about it. We don't hear enough about that. Okay, it worked. The proclamation of the gospel worked so that in Merv here, which was an important place on the Silk Road, by the 5th century, you had bishops. So you had an established church there. Okay? Now in China, the story was that there really wasn't any proclamation of the gospel until what was called the Tang Dynasty, which happened in 618 to 907, which was considered a great time in world history. Yes?
I think it was 60-some years ago, I took a course in college about the history of China. And my recollection, hazy though it might be after all this time, was that the Jesuits were credited with Christianizing China. And that, I assume, again, my memory is hazy on this, would have been perhaps in the 17th century.
Right. And I'm looking
And
at
I haven't read
the
Wilkins'
first,
chapter on this yet.
so the first 1,000 years, of course, there was no Jesuits. That happened far later. That happened in the 12th or 13th century, I think.
1500s.
What?
1500s.
1500. Oh,
Yeah, it was a
even later.
response to
Even
the-
later.
to the-
So here we're talking about 635 AD. So was there Christianity in China in 635 AD? There was. Here's the story. So what I have here is what's called a Nestorian stele. Nestorian, of course, is Nestorius, who is considered a heretic by the Western Church. But the Persian, Syriac-speaking monks were Nestorians. And so this thing is called a Nestorian stele. It's about 9 feet, to 10 feet high, made out of black limestone, 3.5 feet wide, and it's covered with over 1,800 Chinese characters with Syriac mixed in. And the Syriac is there, and then the Chinese translation. So here's the word, and here's how you say it in Chinese, is right there. And this stele was in a monastery. So when people would pass by, they would know what this Christianity was about. So in 635, there was actually an official decree from the emperor, whose name is Emperor Taizong, and it's there in your handout. I'll read it to you. The Persian monk Alopen has come from afar bringing scriptures and teaching. The meaning of the teaching has been carefully examined. It is mysterious, wonderful, calm. It fixes the essentials of life and perfection. It is the salvation of living beings. It is the wealth of man. It is right that it should spread through the empire. Therefore, let the local officials build a monastery in the Aining quarter with 21 regular monks. I was so struck by the way the emperor described Christianity. You know, it's important for us to remember that it is new to many people, even those who have heard the gospel over and over again. When you proclaim the gospel as it is meant to be, it is mysterious, it is wonderful, and it is calming. Calming. I'm delighted with that vision of that's our calling when we proclaim the gospel. When you tell people about Jesus Christ, are you entering into the mystery of Christ? Are you telling them how wonderful He is? And are you giving that hope of peace? So anyhow, the story about this stele is that, again, it was erected in 781. And it actually was removed in 845. So 781 to 845. That's about how long the stele was up. Because in, what year was it? In 845, there was an imperial edict to limit all foreign religion, including Christianity. So for that short period of time, Christianity existed in China, but by 845, it was completely suppressed. And so that in 987, 100 and some years later, a monk comes from Baghdad to China to try to preach the gospel to the people who are there. He goes, all the Christians have been killed. There are no more churches. They've all been burned down. And Christianity no longer exists in China. I just want to let you know that in 1949, there were 4 million Christians in China. Today, it's hard to estimate, but they think there are 26 million. So the story in China is very interesting because it speaks about a time where Christianity flourished and then was immediately suppressed by the state, and yet today it still exists. And this is Christ spreading the gospel to the ends of the earth. Are we doing good? Okay, I can't get to India because I ran out of time. So, oh, by the way, this is what it says on the Nestorian stele. Purification is made perfect by solitude and meditation. Self-restraint grows strong by silence and watching. What a word from the Christian faith to the people of China. So India claims that St. Thomas brought the good news there, 52 AD. He was given a vision. Jesus said, go to India. Thomas said, no thank you. I don't know the language. I don't really want to. And Jesus says, I don't care. You're going to go. And so he goes. And there's some great stories about him. This is the church that was thought to have built in 52 AD. Again, made several times over and over. Here's the inside. If you're familiar with Indian culture, this is going to look really familiar to you. This is kind of how some Hindu temples look too. So I thought it was really interesting to see how the cultural milieu really reflects in the worship. And now we're to our two questions. I'll just leave you with this. For Jesus, the unity of his disciples was so important that he came to break down the barriers of all people. When we worship, when we live together, and we live with people who are so different from us, do we know that our calling and our purpose is to learn how to live with one another as one? Because that's the way God lives. Or are we going to be okay with there being an Armenian church down the street? So, okay, thanks guys.